In this lesson group, we learn more about how the wind blows and how clouds form. Let's dig into some of the science you'll be learning. We'll be looking at how migrating birds have to compensate for Earth's rotation, but that actually has a lot to do with weather and the way air moves on Earth. You can really see it clearly when you notice that all hurricanes spin the same direction in the northern hemisphere. To figure out what's going on, let's actually head to the South Pole. At the South Pole Scientific Research Station, they have flags that form a circle around the pole, which we know is Earth's rotation axis. If we floated up in a balloon above the flag circle, we'd notice something interesting. We'd actually witness Earth's rotation. The flags move one circumference every 24 hours. How fast is that? Well, we can plug into the equation for circumference, pi times the diameter, and figure out that that's about 75 feet every 24 hours. That works out to about 3 feet per hour. But if we zoom out and do that same calculation for an imaginary circle of flags around the equator, we'd see that they move more than 1,000 miles an hour, because Earth's radius at the equator is so much bigger than the flag circle. So if we zoom out and summarize all that, Earth's surface is moving 1,000 miles per hour at the equator, but less than 1 mile per hour up at the poles. And the Earth's atmosphere rotates along with the planet. So what effect will that have on bird migration as they move from near the pole towards the equator? It works a lot like a river where the current is flowing fastest in the center. If you're in a boat traveling straight across the river, it will get swept up in the fast-moving current and get turned towards the right. The same thing happens to migrating birds, so they have to adjust their path as they move from the slow currents in the north towards the fast-moving currents near the equator. And the same thing happens to storms. As air masses move towards or away from the equator, they get deflected, and that sets up the spinning for hurricanes. But it actually affects the movement of all winds as they move from high pressure to low pressure. So how do we introduce all this to our students? In Lesson 3.10, students begin with the Patterns in Weather Conditions quiz, which is on material from the previous lesson group. Once all students have completed the quiz, we introduce the students to the new phenomenon about migrating birds compensating for Earth's rotation. To understand, how does Earth's rotation affect birds? Students then work through a hands-on balloon activity with the bird migration experiment worksheet. They'll share the results as a group. In Lesson 3.11, students consider the question, how does the Earth's rotation affect weather and climate? And participate in a brief discussion. The Earth's rotation presentation introduces a card sort where students look for patterns and images of cyclones in the northern and southern hemispheres. When the class shares out, they'll discover that all the cyclones in the northern hemisphere spin the same way, which is opposite of what happens in the southern hemisphere. So then students are going to participate in a second presentation, the Earth's Rotation and Weather Systems presentation. And it contains a clever experiment to determine if water circles the drain in opposite directions in different hemispheres. And the presentation includes a really cool video that shows the experiment with dual toilets flushing. We introduced cyclones, but students probably have a lot more questions. And in order to answer them, we're going to introduce another phenomenon, a temperature map here of the United States, where the temperature over northern Texas is very cold on the western side of this picture here, but much warmer towards the east. What's going on here will help us explain what factors contribute to cyclones. We start Lesson 3.12 by reviewing how the rotation affects birds and the weather. Students view a TV weather report of strong winter storms, and then we introduce the Texas weather map phenomenon. Students then participate in the Cyclones and Air Masses presentation, and after the presentation, we revisit the northern Texas temperature map. What explains the difference? Can they spot evidence that a cyclone might have occurred? In Lesson 3.13, students revisit the Texas temperature map and focus on how the wind might change around these big storms. In the Cyclones and Wind presentation, students explore what is the relationship between wind, pressure, and storms. As a check for understanding, students take a brief quiz and then they complete an exit ticket where they write down 2 things that they've learned about storms so far. In Lesson 3.14, we return to the Weather and Climate Unit Roadmap, and we discuss how the differences in current weather might affect what people do. That motivates our big question, how is society affected or influenced by weather? Which we explore through using prompts in a short presentation. Next, students are going to update their weather data for their adopted cities before they go out and conduct research about their adopted cities to find evidence of ways that daily life and society are influenced by the weather. And they summarize their findings on the Weather and Society worksheet. Finally, we have students start planning for a video or phone interview that they're going to do with someone from one of the adopted cities that they've chosen that's outside their hometown. Well, we've blown through our wind lessons, but the reason we have clouds is still a little foggy. We'll make a cloud in a bottle to see if we can explain how it forms. In Lesson 3.15, students begin by summarizing the aspects of weather that they've studied so far: temperature, air pressure, and wind. And then we jump right into making the cloud in a bottle with a demonstration. There are teacher instructions for doing the demo with and without a Pocket Lab device. And the Pocket Lab really lets you see the humidity in the data even when it's invisible inside the bottle. After that demonstration, students participate in a brief guided discussion and then draw a pictorial model of what they think's going on inside. They're probably full of questions, and we're going to give them a chance to plan an investigation to answer some of those questions. They're going to modify and extend the demo that we did, and then briefly perform the investigation so they'll be ready to discuss the results tomorrow. The goal of Lesson 3.16 is to relate their bottle investigation to what goes on in the real atmosphere. We start with a whole class debrief of yesterday's investigations. Then students participate in the clouds presentation to compare their ideas to some of the models that scientists have developed for how clouds form. Next, once students have updated their past weather data for their adopted cities, it's time to start looking for patterns. Finally, students participate in the Unit Concept Checkpoint number 1, which is a formative assessment that provides students with the opportunity to better understand some of the primary concepts that we've had so far in the unit. In Lesson 3.17, students first update their weather notebook, and then we show students how to calculate their forecast score for each temperature forecast, and then they pair up and calculate. Students share their forecast scores on a class board and discuss the class results. Next, we all participate at the Weather Forecasting 2 interactive presentation, which emphasizes how forecasting is based on probability and not definite facts or statements. Thus far, we've been focusing in on what goes on in individual cities and what affects their weather. Up next, we'll zoom out and look at some global climate patterns.